The east side of Cade County is flat wheat ground, as flat as the ridge country on the west side is steep, and the spring this story starts the whole of that flat side lay, plowed and clean from one county road to the next, mile after mile of bare-worked dirt without a tree or a fence row or a blade of anything standing on it. Because the price of wheat was good, and the tractors had gotten big, and every farmer on that side of the county had spent 10 years pulling out his hedges and filling his draws and plowing right up to the road ditch so that not 1 foot of ground that could grow a bushel stood idle. Every farmer, that is, except one. Ansel Tarrant farmed 900 acres out on the far flat end of Half Moon Road, good deep ground, some said the best dirt in the county, and straight down the west side of his best quarter section ran a wide shaggy belt of trees, near 40 acres of it in all. Osage orange and cottonwood and red cedar and wild plum all grown up together in a strip you could not see through, with more strips like it laid crossways every half-mile through his fields, and he would not plow them out, would not sell the timber, would not so much as let a man cut fence posts in there without asking. 40 acres and more of prime wheat land, folks said, given over to scrub brush and rabbits in the middle of the best wheat prices in a generation. Verge Kittredge farmed the 2 sections just north of him, clean as a tabletop, and Verge stood at the scale window of the grain elevator in town one morning in the fall and said it the way it got said for years after. Not mean, just certain, that Ansel Tarrant was the only man he ever knew who kept 40 acres of the best dirt in Cade County as a game preserve for cottontails, that a man could run a picture show in town on what that brush strip would gross in wheat, and that if hard-headedness was a crop old Ansel, would have led the county every year running. The men at the scale laughed, and Verge's boy Dorsey, who drove their big new tractor, started calling the Tarrant place the Rabbit Ranch, and the name went around the way names do, and men hauling grain past that long green shaggy line in a county gone all bare and clean would shake their heads at good dirt wasted, and that fall the flat end of Cade County only laughed. 3 springs later, on the morning after a wind that people on that side of the county still talk about, those same men would drive up Ansel Tarrant's lane 1 truck at a time to stand in his yard with their caps in their hands and ask him for tree seedlings out of his nursery rows. And Verge Kittredge, who had 1,000 acres of his own dirt lying that morning in the road ditches of 2 townships, would be the last one up the lane and the one who stayed the longest. Now you have to understand what wind does to bare ground, because the whole of this story sits on that one thing, and most of the flat end of Cade County had forgotten it the way you forget a thing that has not bit you in a while. Topsoil is not just dirt. The dark top foot of a wheat field is the whole savings account of that farm. 100 years and more of rotted roots and old grass gone back into the ground, and it is the only part of the ground that grows anything, and the plain, hard fact about it is that it is light. The very rot and richness that makes it grow wheat also makes it lighter than the dead clay under it, and when it is worked fine, and lies bare and dry with nothing growing on it and nothing standing over it, a strong wind does not blow across it, a strong wind picks it up and carries it away. And wind at the ground does not work the way most folks think. A wind of 30 miles an hour a foot above a bare field does not slide over the dirt. It tumbles and bounces the loose grains along, and every bouncing grain knocks 2 more loose where it lands, so that blowing dirt feeds on itself and gets worse the farther it runs, which is why a blow always starts thin at the windward edge of a field and stands up thick as smoke at the far fence, and why the worst thing you can set next to a bare field is another bare field, and the worst thing you can set next to that is a third one, and a county plowed clean from road to road with nothing standing on it anywhere is not 100 separate farms in a wind. It is one single runway of loose dirt 40 miles long, and the wind gets a running start at one end of it and does not set anything down again until the fences of the last farm catch what is left. There is exactly one cheap thing on this earth that breaks that run, and it has been known and forgotten and known again for as long as men have plowed flat country, and it is a line of trees. A belt of trees does not stop wind, it lifts it. Wind that strikes a wall of brush and timber 40 feet tall rises up and over and does not lay back down onto the ground again for a long way past, 10 times the height of the trees and more, so that one shaggy strip of Osage orange and cottonwood standing across the west side of a quarter section throws a still shadow of quiet air 400 yards deep across the dirt behind it. And in that shadow the wind at the ground never gets its running start, the loose grains never begin to bounce, the field keeps its skin. And there is more to it than that. Because the same belt that lifts the summer wind also catches the winter snow and banks it deep along its own feet and lets it melt slow into the ground instead of blowing off into the road ditch. So that the strips were watering Ansel Terrence wheat all spring out of drifts that had blown off other men's fields, and cutting the hot south wind in July that cooks the milk out of a wheatberry the week before harvest, and every one of those things had been worked out and written down by men who had watched flat country blow before. And none of it was secret, and the whole flat end of Cade County had walked away from it one bulldozed hedgerow at a time. Because trees do not gross anything, and the ground they stand on grosses nothing, and no banker ever once asked a man at renewal time how tall his windbreaks stood. Because here is what had happened on the flat side of the county in the 10 years before, and there was no meanness in any of it, only arithmetic. Wheat was high, and tractors had gone from 2 plows to 5, and a big machine hates a small field. Every hedge and tree line and grassed draw on a place cost a man 10 turns a day, and a strip of shaded, root-robbed wheat along both sides of it, and the arithmetic said pull them. And the whole county did the arithmetic together, and the doozers came. And for 10 falls running you could stand in the elevator lot and watch brush piles burning in every quarter of the compass, the old hedges and shelter rows that the grandfathers had set out going up in smoke a mile at a time, and the fields ran together into one great clean sweep of dirt that a 5-bottom rig could work all day without lifting a plow. And the county had never grossed more wheat in its life than it did in those years, and the whole time, the way a man spends down a savings account a little a year and calls it income. The flat side of Cade County was spending its dirt. They had been lucky in the weather, that was the part nobody said out loud, a run of kind wet springs with the ground never bare and dry and loose at the same time the big winds came through, and luck that holds long enough stops being called luck. It starts being called the way things are now, and any man who kept on farming like the wind was real. Giving up ground to trees and leaving his stubble rough through the winter, stopped looking careful to his neighbors and started looking quaint, and then started looking foolish. And that is the exact spot Ansel Terrence stood in for 10 years. A tall, raw-boned old man farming behind his shaggy tree strips like a settler. The Rabbit Ranch, the last farm on the flat end of the county that the dozers had never touched. But here is what Ansel Terrence was actually doing behind those trees, strip by strip and season by season, and it is the thing not one man at the elevator could see from the scale window. The belts were not wild brush, whatever they looked like from the road. They were built, row by row, the way you build a roof. The outside row on the windward side was low tough stuff. Wild plum and chokecherry grown in a thick hedge that forced the wind to start climbing early. Then 2 rows of red cedar standing dense and green to the ground to seal the base so the wind could not knife through underneath. Then the tall timber in the middle, cottonwood and hackberry and green ash to throw the wind high. Then Osage orange on the field side, thorned and close. And Ansel walked those belts every winter with a saw and an axe the way other men walked their machine sheds, cutting out the dead wood, coppicing the Osage orange back so it sprouted thick from the stump, filling every gap the day it showed. Because a windbreak with a hole in it is worse than none, the wind finds the hole and comes through it like water through a cutbank. Faster than it ran in the open, and he knew the height of every belt and the reach of its shadow of still air. And he had his quarter sections laid out so that no acre of his dirt lay more than a quarter mile from timber standing upwind of it. That was the first thing. The second thing was the way he worked his dirt, and it was the thing that looked shiftless to a county that liked a field plowed black and harrowed fine as garden soil. because Ansel Tarrant never once in his life left a field naked to the winter. His wheat stubble stood all winter, anchored in its own roots with the snow banked in it, and where he summer-fallowed he worked the ground with a chisel and a lister that left it standing in rough ridges and clods too heavy for the wind to lift, never disked out fine, and he laid his fallow ground in narrow strips crossways to the south wind, with growing wheat on both sides of every strip, so that on his whole 900 acres there was never one wide sweep of loose bare dirt lying open at the same time, and the men at the elevator had a word for how his fields looked in March next to their own clean black ones, and the word was trashy, and Ansel took it the way he took most things, silent, because the trash they were pointing at was his topsoil wearing its coat. And the third thing was the nursery rows. Down along the south side of his yard, past the garden, Ansel kept a half-acre of young trees coming on all the time, cedar and plum and Osage orange and cottonwood whips by the hundred, grown from seed and cuttings off his own belts. Because his belts were living things that had to be renewed a row at a time as the old timber aged, and he potted and heeled in far more seedlings every year than he could ever set out himself, and when a county agent or a soil man from the college stopped by, which they did more often than anybody in town ever knew, Ansel would walk them down the nursery rows and say a man never knows when his neighbors might take up an interest in trees. And it sounded like a joke, and he did not smile when he said it. And he kept the rows full. The reason he kept the rows full was named Elam Tarrant, and he had been dead for 40 years. Elam was Ansel's grandfather, and Elam Tarrant had come onto that flat ground when it was virgin sod and had been one of the men who broke it out, and he had lived long enough to watch what he and his neighbors had done come back for them. Because there had been a bad stretch of dry years on that plain when Ansel was a boy, dust years, and the Tarrant place had blown then like everybody's. The sky brown at noon, the fences drifted under, the seed wheat blown clean out of the ground twice in one spring, and Elam Tarrant had stood in his own dooryard in the middle of it, an old man by then, and made his grandson look at it, and told him that every ton of dirt going by in the air over their heads was money out of somebody's pocket that no rain would ever put back, and that he wanted the boy to hear it from the man who had helped do it. That they had skinned this country themselves, nobody had done it to them, they had pulled off the sod that held the dirt down, and then acted surprised when the dirt got up and left, and the spring, after the rains came back, Elam Turner Tarrant put in the first tree strip on the west line with his own hands. An old man setting Osage orange whips into the ground he knew he would never live to see stand tall, and the last thing of any account he ever said to Ansel, said in the wagon on the way home from setting out cedars, was the law the whole rest of this story runs on, that a man never owned an inch of his topsoil, he only kept it out of the wind, and the day he quits keeping it is the day it starts to leave. Ansel's father had widened the belts, and Ansel had built the system, and that is who Ansel Tarrant was, not a dreamer and not a crank, but the third man in a straight line to hold the same 40 acres of trees against the same wind on the same ground it had already happened on once, in living memory to people whose name he carried. He had buried his wife Nona 10 years back, and his son was grown and gone to the western part of the state with a place of his own, and Ansel had gone on alone, and the county had forgotten the dust years the way a man forgets a broken arm, and he had not, and that is the whole difference this story turns on. He did not hold it entirely alone that last spring, and the help came from a direction nobody would have picked. Marnie Ost was 26 years old and farming her dead husband's rented quarter section a mile east of the Tarrant Belts, farming it alone with an old tractor and no money. The only woman farming her own ground on that end of the county, and the same men who called Ansel's place the Rabbit Ranch gave her 1 year, 2, at the outside, and said it kindly, and were kind men, and were wrong. She came over to the Tarrant place the first time to buy straw, and she saw the strips and the stubble and the rough striped fallow, and she did not laugh. She asked questions, and they were good questions, and Ansel answered every one the way he would have answered a neighbor of 40 years. And by the second visit he was walking her fields with her, and what he told her was plain. that her landlord had pulled the hedges off that quarter years ago, and she was farming a naked field a mile downwind of a county of naked fields, and she could not put back 40 years of timber in one spring, but she could keep her stubble standing, and quit disking her dirt down to powder, and list her follow in strips crossways to the south, and take 500 cedar and plum seedlings out of his nursery rows on no charge, and get a first line started along her south and west fences, and Marnie Ost did every single one of those things that very year, the only ground on the flat end of Cade County besides his own that went into that last winter with its coat on. And down at the elevator they said old Tarrant had finally found somebody green enough to take him seriously, and Dorsey Kittredge said the rabbit ranch was expanding. And Marnie heard it and kept her rose anyway, which at 26, with 1/4 section and no husband and every man at the scale window watching her fail, is a good deal harder than it sounds. The county's soil man came out that same fall. A quiet fellow named Custis Weld, who had the job of driving all of Cade County looking at ground, and he spent a whole afternoon on the Tarrant place walking the belts with a spade, digging little holes in field after field, and what he found he told Ansel straight at the tailgate, that Ansel had the deepest, darkest, best-kept topsoil left on the flat side of the county, that behind his belts the dirt was still black and heavy and full of root and holding its moisture a foot down in a dry fall, while on the clean sections north of him Custis was already spading up pale, hungry dirt gone thin at the knolls, ground that had been quietly bleeding off the top of itself for 10 years of clean tillage with nobody watching. And then he told Ansel the honest hard thing too, because that was the kind of man he was, that none of it showed up at the scale. That Virg Kittredge's naked sections had out-yielded and outgrossed the Tarrant place 2 falls out of 3 and would go right on doing it in any kind year, because Ansel was carrying 40 acres of trees off the tax rolls of his own pocket and cropping the rest of his ground easier than it would bear, and that by every number the bank or the elevator ever looked at, the clean farmers were beating him, and it was not close. Ansel asked him one question. He asked whether Custis Weld had ever stood on that flat in a dry March and watched a 50-mile-an-hour south wind cross 10 miles of worked bare dirt with not one thing standing in its way taller than a fence post, and Custis stood quiet a minute and said no, that the weather had been kind since he took the job, and that when he thought about that wind on all that clean ground he did not much care for his own thoughts. Ansel said his trees were not planted against the kind years, and that a man who is beating you 2 falls out of 3 on borrowed dirt is not ahead of you. He just has not been billed yet, and Custis Weld wrote that in his book, word for word, and did not argue. Now understand what kind of weather came on, because the sky set the trap with all the patience in the world, and the flat end of Cade County walked into it, praising the rain that did not fall. It came on dry in the fall, a wheat planting season with the ground powdered dry so that half the county seed lay in dust waiting on a rain that came late and thin, and it stayed dry through a winter that anybody could see was wrong. An open winter, no snow to speak of, the ground bare and freezing and thawing and crumbling itself finer with every turn. And men stood at the elevator that January and said it would even up in the spring. It always evened up. And the spring came on dry, too. And windy, the way a dry spring on flat country is always windy, because there was nothing on the ground to hold the damp and nothing in the dirt to hold itself. And by the middle of March, the flat side of Cade County lay in exactly the shape the arithmetic had been building toward for 10 years. 40 miles of cleared county, plowed and disked fine the fall before, dust dry, freeze crumbled, seed half sprouted or never sprouted, without one hedgerow left standing on the whole run of it, and the whole county lay there under a hard blue sky waiting for one thing, and on the 29th of March, out of the southwest, it came. The wind came up before noon, and it was not a gust and gone. It set in and blew. 40 miles an hour, steady and gusting well past 50, hour after hour, and it found the loose dirt at the southwest corner of the county the way a spark finds tinder, and the bouncing grains began to knock more grains loose, and the blow fed on itself northeast across farm after naked farm exactly the way the old men remembered and the young men had never seen. And by 2 in the afternoon, the flat end of Cade County had gone brown to the top of the sky. The sun a pale dime you could look straight at. Dirt hissing off every bare field, and standing up in a rolling brown wall 100 feet high, headlights on at midday, hens gone to roost at 3 in the afternoon. Dirt sifting under every door in every farmhouse, and drifting like brown snow along the fence lines, and there was not one single thing a man on any of those clean sections could do but stand at his own window and watch 10 years of the best topsoil in the county get up off his fields and go northeast into the next township. And the wind blew on into the dark and most of the night. And it did in one afternoon what no hail and no frost had ever done to that county. Because hail takes a crop and frost takes a crop, but the wind was taking the ground itself. Understand what that day carried off, because the wind is not the story, the wind is only the bill coming due. A crop is 1 year, you lose it and you plant again. But the dark top foot of a field is every year at once. All the capital there is, and the dirt standing up brown over Cade County that afternoon was not that year's wheat, that was already mostly dead of drought. It was the next 50 years of everybody's wheat, airborne, headed northeast. The finest and richest and lightest part of the soil, always the first part to rise, and when the wind finally laid late that night, the flat side of the county had lost the heart of its dirt off every clean worked field, an inch here, 3 inches there, cut down to lister, sole, and hardpan on the knolls, seed and fertilizer gone with it, and where the flying dirt had finally found something to stop it, a fence, a road ditch, a farmstead windbreak around somebody's house, it had piled in drifts you could lose a dog in. The road along Verge Kittredge's south line drifted, shut like a snow road in January, dirt to the second wire of the fences, and the men who dug out those roads the next week were shoveling their own fields out of the county right-of-way, and every man of them knew it. And behind Ansel Terrence tree strips, that whole roaring afternoon, the dirt lay still. This is the part men told for years after, and it needs no polish. The same wind that stood the rest of the flat end on edge came over the Tarrant West Belt and went up, the way 60 years of grown timber makes it go up, and it did not get back down to the ground before the next strip lifted it again. And in the long, quiet shadows behind those shaggy, despised rows of osage, orange, and cedar and cottonwood, the air at the dirt stayed so nearly calm that the standing stubble barely leaned, and the rough clotted strip fallow lay there too heavy to lift with its ridges catching what little came in, and the drifted snow the belts had banked all the winter before had left just enough damp a spade deep to hold the crumb of the surface together. And Ansel Terrence 900 acres, sitting in the dead middle of the worst blow that county had seen in a lifetime of years, lost so nearly nothing that when Custis Weld came with his spade 2 weeks after, he could not honestly measure the difference from his notes of the fall before. His wheat, the half of it that had come up in that dry fall, stood on through the blow behind the timber and made that summer about the only harvested grain on the flat end of the county. And the strips did one thing more, a thing Ansel had said out loud years before and been laughed at for down at the elevator. They caught his neighbors' fields for them. All along the west face of every Tarrant belt the flying dirt off the naked sections upwind, piled into the brush and cedar like snow into a snow fence. Hundreds of tons of the finest topsoil on the flat side lying banked in those tree rows to the height of a man's waist, dirt off Kittredge ground, and dirt from 3 miles southwest of that. Held there soft and deep instead of gone northeast out of the county for good, and the first thing anybody in Cade County said out loud about the whole matter, before the roads were even dug open, was Dorsey Kittredge, who walked his family's south line the morning after with a shovel in his hand and no work it could do that mattered. and came home along the Tarrant West Belt and stood a long time looking at the great soft drifts of his own farm's dirt lying caught in the Rabbit Ranch brush, and said at the supper table that night, to nobody in particular, that the rabbits had more of their topsoil this evening than the family did. Custis Weld said his piece first, because it was his job to drive the whole Flat End that week and look at what the county had done to itself, and he made no ceremony of it. He stood at the Tarrant tailgate and said he had told Ansel in the fall that the clean farmers were beating him and it was not close, and that he had been wrong in the only week that would ever matter, and he wanted it in his own book, in his own hand. And then he asked Ansel the question his job required him to ask, which was whether Ansel would stand in a field with him and say all of it, the belts and the stubble and the strips and the rough fallow, to whatever part of Cade County could be talked into coming, because the county was going to plant trees now. All of it. The way a man quit smoking in the hospital, and it would go crooked and half-hearted unless somebody who had done it right stood up and showed the pattern. Ansel said he would, provided nobody expected him to enjoy it. Virge Kittredge took 9 days. He was a proud man with 1,000 acres of skinned ground and a boy watching him to learn what a man does when he has been wrong out loud for 10 years. And both of those weighed on him the whole 9 days, and the morning he finally came, he sat in his truck at the foot of the Tarrant Lane a long while first, and Ansel saw him down there and let him sit, because he had watched Virge Kittredge coming for 10 years, the way Dosha Murrell over in the Ridge Country had once watched a different man coming for 30. And when Virge finally stood in the yard with his cap in his hands, he did not soften it or excuse it. He said he had come to buy trees, as many as could be had, and to be shown, and that he had stood at that scale window for 10 years and called the smartest farming on the flat end of the county a rabbit ranch, and had dozed out in one fall for 80 acres of wheat. Hedgerows, his own father, had set out to stop exactly what had now happened, and that whatever the seedlings cost, saying this much out loud, had cost him more, and Ansel took him down the nursery rows and did not make it easy nor hard, only quiet. He would not take Virge Kittredge's money, and it was not softness, and Virge knew it. It was the nursery rows finally doing the one thing 40 years of full rows had been kept full to do. He gave Virge cedar and plum and Osage orange by the 100 and the loan of his planting bar, and a fall afternoon walking the naked Kittredge sections, laying out where the lines must run, a belt on the south and west of every quarter, low brush windward, and tall timber in the middle. Gaps closed the year they show, and more than the trees he gave him the working rules for the 20 years it would take the timber to grow. Stubble standing every winter of your life. No field disc fine and left naked. Follow in narrow strips crossways to the south wind, clods on the surface all winter, because the trees are the roof, but the tillage is the walls. And a man can hold most of his dirt with tillage alone while his trees are coming if he will only quit farming like the wind died with his grandfather. Virge Kittredge did all of it over the years that came after, and did it the way converted men do things, completely, and the Kittredge sections greened their new belts up out of the crumbled dirt year by year. And the two men were not friends exactly. They were the thing flat country respects more, neighbors who had settled it. And when Virge hauled his first decent crop after the blow year, he stopped his truck at the foot of the Tarrant Lane and blew the horn once and lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, and that was the whole conversation, and both of them counted it sufficient. Marnie Ost's rented quarter had come through the blow like the Tarrant ground, small as her start was. Her stubble had stood, and her strips had held, and her year-old fence-line seedlings had lived through it, drifted half over. And the landlord, who had been one season from turning her off, drove out, looked at his farm, still lying on his farm, with the neighbor sections cut to hardpan on either side of it, and signed her for 5 years. And it went around the elevator inside a month exactly whose rules she had been farming by, and the men at the scale window quit giving Marnie Ost 1 more year, and a few of them, that same fall, were standing in Ansel Tarrant's nursery rows themselves with their caps in their hands, buying trees from the Rabbit Ranch and taking the typed page that went with them. Because that is how it spread. Ansel and Custis Weld stood in a blown-out field that April and said the whole of it to better than 200 farmers from 4 townships, and Ansel Tarrant, who had not made 3 public remarks in 30 years, stood on a hayrack in the wind and said that nothing he did was his, that every rule on the page was paid for the first time this county blew. By men now dead who had watched it blow and set out trees with their own hands so their grandsons would not have to learn it again, and that the county had not been struck by weather, it had been billed for its bookkeeping, and the seedlings went out of his nursery rows by the thousand that spring and every spring after. To better than 80 farms across the flat end of Cade County and the 2 counties east of it where his dirt had gone, and with every bundle went the page he typed himself on Nona's old machine and ran off at the library in town, and the page said what to do and, more to the point, what to quit doing. Plant your belts on the south and west of every quarter and close every gap the year it shows. Leave your stubble standing every winter, all of it, every year. Work your fallow rough and cloddy and lay it in narrow strips crossways to the south wind, and never disk any field fine and leave it naked in any season. Keep your own nursery rows coming so the belts can be renewed and your neighbor can be started, because your farm is only as safe as the ground upwind of it. And at the bottom of the page, the one line that was not an instruction was the sentence an old man had said in a wagon coming home from planting cedars, that a man never owns an inch of his topsoil, he only keeps it out of the wind, and the day he quits keeping it is the day it starts to leave. The belts never left the Tarrant place. That was the part the county came to like best, that the 40 acres of scrub that a whole flat township had grinned at stood right where they had always stood, and Ansel Tarrant never plowed out 1 rod of them in his life, not in the best wheat year, not ever. And the place never once outgrossed the clean big operators in a kind year, and never would, and Ansel would tell you so himself. Flat. And every March when the wind came up hard out of the southwest and the whole county held its breath a little, the way it always would now, the flat end of Cade County lay grain striped from one road to the next with young shelter belts in their fence lines, 80 farms of them, every last row of it traceable back to a half-acre of nursery rows on a place the county had called the Rabbit Ranch. And nobody called it that anymore, and the men who once had were the ones who saw to it that nobody did. If you have stayed with him this far, you already know this was never about trees. Ansel Tarrant is the reason the flat side of that county has windbreaks on it to this day, and he never made but the one speech about it, and he never once said I told you so to a single man who had laughed at him, and to the end of his rows he would tell you he had not been clever, he had only been a boy in a dooryard once while the sky went brown at noon. Standing next to an old man honest enough to say we did this ourselves, and he had simply declined, for the length of one working life, to make his grandfather a liar. He was laughed at for 10 years by good men who were not cruel, only certain, and he was proven right in one afternoon by a wind that did not care about any of them, and in between he did nothing but walk his belts with a saw. Keep his stubble standing, rough his fallow, feel his nursery rows, and let the arithmetic call him a fool every single fall at the scale window. That is all stewardship ever is. It is the small unpaid thing, done the plain old careful way every season it is due for 40 years, so that on the one afternoon that matters your ground is wearing its coat while the sky takes everything that is not held down. So tell me which one you would have been at that scale window in the fat years. There were only 2 kinds of farmer on that flat, and neither kind was a bad man. The ones who looked at 40 acres of scrub in the middle of prime wheat ground and saw a stubborn old man throwing away the best prices in a generation, and the one who looked at those same shaggy rows and saw the only dirt in the township that would still be lying on its own fields the morning after a day nobody had come to yet. Be honest about it. Most of us are the first kind, and the first kind is not stupid, it is only certain, and certain is the most expensive thing a man can be. Write down in the comments which one you were, and tell me what part of the country you are reading this from tonight. because I read every one of them and I like knowing where you all are sitting. Next time, I want to tell you about a widow over in the Creek country of that same county who would not let anybody drain the crooked old slough that took up the middle of her best bottomland meadow, and what her neighbors came to ask her the summer the wells on that side of the county began to go dry. And if this one got to you, send it on to somebody who has been told that the old careful way they do a thing, the slow way, the way that gives up a little every year to be sure, is a foolish waste of good money. Out on the flat end of Half Moon Road, an hour before dark, a tall old man in a faded denim jacket walks the West Belt with a planting bar over his shoulder and a bundle of cedar seedlings under his arm. And he stops at a gap in the cedars no wider than a gate. A little thing, nothing a man driving past would ever see, and he sets a young tree into it. One more year.